Facebook now. We're live. We're live now.
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Keepers of the Water, I'd like to welcome you to our third edition in our webinar series focusing on uranium mining. I'm Beverly Andrews. I'll be your moderator for tonight. On behalf of Keepers of the Water, I just want to say we're so happy that you were able to join us this evening. And tonight we are discussing the health impacts of uranium mining on Indigenous bodies. Such an important dialogue to start with the increasing uranium extraction happening in our territories. Resource extraction of any kind has impacts to local communities on health and well-being of the human populations and of the animals and the plants. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Well, let's get started. As you can see, we have a couple of speakers tonight. Let me first introduce you to our Professor and Chair of the Department of Public Health Sciences at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, Douglas Brugge. Hi, Douglas. For over a decade, he has directed the community assessment of freeway exposure and health, and he has worked in community collaborations with many neighborhoods. We're so happy to have you, Douglas. Welcome.
Good to be here. Do you want me to go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead, Douglas.
Okay.
We're all ears.
All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about uranium mining and health, and that'll be the main focus. A little bit at the end on some recent work that I've been involved with about nuclear power. Just to give you a little bit of context, for me, this journey really began in the mid-1990s when I joined with people in the Navajo Nation, and we did a project looking at uranium mines in that area. This is a photograph of one with a radiation meter next to some of the ore outside, showing that it's radioactive. And that work led to a number of things, including a self-published book, Memories Come to Us in the Rain and the Wind, and University of New Mexico Press book that was published that I co-edited with Timothy Benally and Esther Yazzie, and I put links to both of these in the chat. I'm going to talk more about the science and the health effects. This work started out being more about the social impacts and the negative effects it had on the communities out there. Am I heard okay? Can you hear me?
Your sound is nice and clear, yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I know in the start, I had a little bit of a problem with my microphone. So the first thing to know about uranium is that uranium is a radioactive substance, and when it gives off radiation, it changes into another radioactive substance, and that is a long cascade of different elements that are all radioactive, ending with lead at the bottom here, which is stable. And so uranium-238, there are multiple kinds of uranium, turns into thorium, protactinium, another version of uranium, then thorium again. And then the really important elements here are radium, which turns into radon. And the reason that radon is so important and so dangerous is it's a gas. Everything else on this sequence is a solid. And when radon gas is formed, it has a half-life of a little less than 4 days, which is enough time. If you imagine some radium in a uranium ore in a mine, and there's maybe it's in the rocks, or there's some cracks, that radon would have time to seep out, get into the air, and then when it decays, when it gives off radiation, it turns into a very fast, rapid series of what are called radon daughter products. And those are all solids. They're up in the air. They attach themselves to particles in the air. And the people who are around this radon will breathe it in. It can get deep into the lungs, depending on the particle size. And then once it's in the lungs, they're going to continue to give off this radiation, and they cause a huge amount of damage to the lung tissues. So this is a very, very well understood form of radiation and a health hazard, and the association with with lung cancer in particular is very, very well established. Sometimes we're dealing with environmental problems. We're not sure whether there's really a problem. This is an example of something where the evidence is completely convincing and has been for quite a long time. In fact, and these are some charts I made some time ago. Don't worry about the units here. The point is that these are increasing concentrations of radon in the air. This 4 picocuries per liter is the US EPA standard for radon exposure. And then what I've put over here are the number of people out of 1,000 that, if they were exposed to this over a lifetime, would develop lung cancer. So even at the federally regulated level, 7 out of 1,000 people would get lung cancer. Even below that level, some people get lung cancer. And as you increase the exposure, you get more and more people getting lung cancer. And these are in non-smokers. And when you look at smokers, it's far worse. Even at the federally regulated level, you'd have 62 out of 1,000 people getting lung cancer. If you get up here, where you're 5 times above that level, you would have about a quarter of the people getting lung cancer from lifetime exposure. So radon is exquisitely toxic, very, very tiny amounts. I can't even tell you how tiny a picocurie is. These are very, very, very tiny amounts. They would be imperceptible. Radiation is imperceptible anyway, unless it's at massive doses. Imperceptible in the air, are quite harmful to health, all right? But notice also that it's over a lifetime, right? So we're not talking about if you're exposed to 4 picocuries per liter for 10 minutes that you have an appreciable risk. It's long-term high chronic exposure to these kinds of levels that are risky. And let me go back just a bit. The miners, Joe Ray Harvey, is a Navajo man here. The miners who worked in these mines, this is an abandoned mine in 1995. The miners who worked in these mines were exposed to very, very high levels of radon, far above this level, for many of them for years or even a decade or more, and had very, very high risk of developing lung cancer. And one way of seeing that, of demonstrating how large the impact is, this is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act program, which is a US program. It resulted from advocacy of the Navajo people and other miners. It's been reformed. It's been revised a couple of times over the decades, passed originally in 1990. And as of about 2 years ago, they had approved compensation for almost 40,000 people involved in mining. And this, the top here, these are from the Nevada test site. So these are people who were downwind of the above ground nuclear tests. But lots of people, and you can imagine, this is a government program. There are very stringent, strict criteria you have to meet in order to get compensated. You can see they denied a large number of claims. So there are a lot of people who have been compensated, over $2.5 billion of compensation. A big chunk of that to miners, but also a lot to downwinders and on-site personnel. And this picture is one on the Navajo Nation, a little town called Cove. And one of the things that they told us when I was out there in the mid-1990s doing this project, was that there were no men with gray hair. They basically all died in the preceding decades from working in the mines. So, it's just a very well-established risk, radon. Underground mining in particular results in very high exposures. There are other health outcomes besides lung cancer, but lung cancer is the one of most notable concern. Fast forward to 2012, New York Times article, still finding abandoned mills and mines out in that area that had not been remediated, had not been taken care of. And this is a walkover. If you walk over this abandoned mill with a radiation meter, the higher, the darker the color, the black is the darkest, the purple, then red, then orange, and so forth, then the higher the radiation levels. So you can see that this mine, which was sitting out there, this mill rather, that was sitting out there in the middle of nowhere and unattended to for decades, it was still highly, highly radioactive. And we have a little Colorado River over in this direction, so it's near a perennial water source. This is another example. This is Monument Valley, also the Navajo Nation. This is a Navajo home, a hogan, that was built with mine waste. And what you can see is that inside this home, this green line again is the EPA standard acceptable level of radon. And then these orange diamonds are the actual levels of radon in the home. So very, very high levels of radon inside this home. And there were a lot of homes, not just on the Navajo Nation, but other places in the world that were built with mine waste, and then people were essentially living in a mine shaft, right? Because they were surrounded by uranium ore that was giving off this radon, and very, very high risk. But it's not just radon that we need to be concerned about in uranium mining. What I've listed here are some other contaminants. I mentioned radium is part of the uranium decay series. Radium is associated with bone cancer, head cancers, and leukemia. Thorium is in the list, but there's not much research on thorium. That's unfortunate. And then there are non-chemical contaminants like arsenic. I think people have heard of arsenic. Arsenic causes lung and skin cancer, lung cancer again, and skin cancer. It's a neurotoxin. It causes changes to the skin that change the pigmentation in the skin. And then there is just external ionizing radiation as well from these mines, which are associated with cancer, birth defects, and genetic damage. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Just the radium, the classic case was in the 1920s, so 100 years ago. Radium glows in the dark, and so there was a manufacturer of glow-in-the-dark watches with young women and girls who would hand paint radium onto them, and when they made a mistake, they would correct it by sharpening the brush in their mouth with their lips, and thus they would ingest large amounts of this radioactive radium. And many of them died horrible deaths. Some of them lived a long, long time. Some of them developed cancer. But this is an example. This is a cross-section of a bone from one of the watch dial painters. And all this black is radiation. Uranium and radium both deposit in the bone. The body thinks they look like calcium, which is what is used to make bones strong. And so it deposits in the bone. And then once it's there, it's going to stay there a very, very long time, basically to the end of life. I would mention one other thing. It's going to stay there a very long time. However, if during pregnancy, when there's liberation of calcium from the bone for the developing fetus, then that's going to release whatever's in this bone as well. Lead from lead paint and leaded gasoline does the same thing. It deposits in the bone. Uranium itself is much more of a chemical toxin, a toxic metal. It's well established to cause kidney damage in animals. There's some evidence in humans that people who drink a lot uranium contaminated water have greater amounts of kidney damage. And then in the 1990s, 2001 timeframe, this researcher, Jose Domingo, who was in Spain, did a series of animal studies and showed that in a laboratory with animals that if you exposed them to uranium, you had death of the fetuses, you had reduced pregnancy, you had birth defects, cleft palate, and skeletal birth defects. And that was very early evidence of the risk of uranium. And at that time, it wasn't entirely clear, but I think it became increasingly clear over time that this is a chemical reaction, not a factor from radiation. There are some other studies. This is an oocyte, which is the egg, the egg that once it's fertilized becomes an embryo and grows into the fetus. And this is a study, gosh, I can't see the top of my slide, but it basically shows that exposing oocytes to uranium leads to unnatural development and damage to that is harmful to and prohibitive even of forming an embryo and developing further. This is a laboratory study. So Domingo's work was laboratory, and this is also laboratory. It's not people living in the world. This is a Navajo researcher who published what I think still think is a very important study, published in 2007 in the top environmental health journal. And what she basically showed in mice, this is also laboratory, is that uranium caused developmental changes. And they were developmental changes very similar to, I don't know if people know DES, diethylstilbestrol, which was a drug that was given to women in the, I think, 1950s and 60s. Dale can probably correct me. And that led to a lot of birth defects and was taken off the market. So DES causes changes like this. Uranium causes very similar changes. And these are called estrogenic compounds. They have properties like estrogen, the female hormone, and having this external artificial estrogenic activity can lead to developmental changes that are adverse and negative. This is some other work also on the near the Navajo Nation in Northern Arizona University, showing chemical bonding of uranium to DNA, DNA being the genetic material. I think I'm going to skip that slide. So there's been some research in recent years. The research has turned to the effects on communities. We're pretty clear that the miners had very high exposures, especially the underground miners, were at great risk of lung cancer. But what about the communities? They're drinking water that's contaminated. They live nearby the tailing piles from uranium. The children play near them. There's livestock that's feeding on feeding on plants that are growing in contaminated soil. How much of a risk is this? And that research has been slow but steady. One of the early findings was that people in the Navajo area who lived closer to uranium contamination had elevated risk of kidney disease. That's not surprising, but the rest of this is somewhat was unexpected, which is hypertension and diabetes, and that these sort of come together as a collection of outcomes from the uranium exposure. I think this is not as clearly established and certain as the radon and lung cancer pathway, but it's of high concern. This is good work. I think there needs to be more work along these lines to sort of confirm this and make it more certain. And then at the end here, I just want to mention some work, just because I've been involved in it. So this has been a long path for me, starting with the two books, the history, the oral histories, the experiences of people, the photographs of them, doing books and exhibit, and then many things. Dale and I were in Africa a couple of times together about uranium mining. I've been to Virginia many times, where there's a proposal for uranium mining. So there's a lot of things that came out of this, been to Switzerland and to former East Germany. And one of the things more recently is that I got involved with a group of people who are concerned about low dose radiation exposure from the 3 Mile Island nuclear accidents. So in 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, there was a meltdown in one of the nuclear reactors. There was a release of a lot of radiation. And there's been a controversy ever since whether how hazardous that radiation was. And I think the scientific consensus has been that it's not that hazardous, but there are people who thought that it was more hazardous and that people were affected more. And the problem is, we know that with radiation dose, that the higher the dose, the greater the health risk, especially genetic or birth defects or cancer outcomes. But when we get to lower and lower doses, we don't have much data. We don't really know what happens down here. And the assumption has been that it's a linear dose response down. So the lower you get, the lower the risk, but it never goes to zero. And my new colleague on this project, Aaron Datesman, has a hypothesis that actually this risk in this low range is much more than just linear, that is superlinear. And in fact, we've now collected 24 blood samples, half of them from people who had a high exposure from 3 Mile Island and half for the low exposure. And we were working with a lab in Colorado and doing a very sophisticated painting of the chromosomes. This is the genetic material, single cell, the 26 chromosomes laid out. And this method allows us to see aberrations, that is, things that shouldn't have happened. This piece of the chromosome has moved over here. This one has moved as well. It should be here. Instead, it's here. Here's another one that has moved. And then we can look at the people who had high exposure and low exposure and ask whether the high exposure people have more chromosomal damage. And it's very early. We just submitted an abstract, the first 8 samples analyzed, and it looks like there are more in the people with a high exposure. And if that turns out to be true, it would mean a couple of things, that these chromosomal changes last for decades if they're stable. And then also it might indicate, I want to be very careful what I say here, it might indicate that that the exposures at 3 Mile Island were higher and more hazardous than we originally thought or were concerned about. And then I'll just end with one of my photographs from that original project. This is Pearl Nakai, one of the widows whose husband died from working in the uranium mines. It's a photograph in 1995, so it's like almost 30 years ago. It was a long time ago, but anyway, I'll leave it at that. I think the bottom line is that there is a range from radon and radium where we're very confident about the health effects, the harm to the miners, and then indications of risk to the communities as well that are not quite as well established, but the evidence has been growing and getting more convincing over time. So I hope that's sort of what you wanted to hear, Beverly. If we have time, I'd be happy to take a few questions or comments or challenges to my. That's the nature of science. We should always be open to being challenged and questioned about what we do, what we're saying.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, it was a lot. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that. So I was like, I don't know if I missed it or not, but just before we move on, when you were saying that like the radiation, when it deposits in our bones and stuff, do mothers pass that on to their children when they get pregnant?
Yeah, so radium and uranium both deposit in the bone. And when they're pregnant, the fetus's bones form by the body extracting, and Dale can explain this better than me, extracting from from the mother's bones some of the calcium in order to build the bones in the developing fetus. And so when it does that, it's going to extract other things that look like calcium. It could be lead, which we're not talking about tonight, but it could also be the radium and uranium as well.
Wow. So so these children will be born, right, with this, already in their bodies. It's pretty awful.
Yeah.
Right, and it's going to depend on the how much the mother has, right? I mean, if she has a very low or not a trivial level, then it's not a big problem. If she has a much higher level, then that would be of greater concern.
Still something to think about if you live in these areas and this is happening in your territory. So we'll move on as our guests have seen. We also have Dr. Dewar with us tonight. She's an anti-nuclear activist since the 80s and has published articles and spoken at conferences about nuclear proliferation. Dr. Dewar is an associate professor at the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. She's also the co-writer of From Hiroshima to Fukushima to You with Florian, I hope saying it, Oelck. Florian Oelck. I hope that's how I say it.
That's close enough.
And she's also an active member of the International Committee for the Society of Rural Physicians. She is joining us tonight to share more general information about the medical impacts of uranium mining on our bodies. And we're pleased to have you tonight, Dr. Dewar. Please take it away.
All right, thank you. I did have some slides, but they seem to have vanished. I'm speaking to you from New Roots Land Trust, located on Treaty 4, homeland of the Saulteaux, Cree, Lakota, Dakota, and Assiniboine First Nations, and homelands of the Métis. The treaty has not been fulfilled in either spirit or intent. As a settler who benefits from ongoing colonial oppression, I work to dismantle the inequity and brutality of the system. The topic tonight is uranium health, uranium mining and health, but I won't be limiting my comments, as Doug as well did, to uranium itself, but to the health effects of ionizing radiation, which I'll refer to as radiation simply after this, or more or less. Anyway, declaration: I have no conflict of interest. I receive no salary or funds from any organization supporting or opposing the nuclear industry in part or whole. Now, I am going to like to do a shared screen because I don't think, now, this is what I have not done, share screen. And here it is. A map of Saskatchewan, which I want notice that Saskatchewan can almost be drawn with a ruler. It's the only province in Canada that can. When we're speaking of mining in northern Saskatchewan, we're speaking of the north as roughly being a line drawn across the map at this point, and the population of the northern Saskatchewan is roughly 90,000 people, of which probably 90% are Dene, or Indigenous woodland Cree. The uranium mining is seen by the government in Regina as a cash cow. This is roads and likely communication systems have, in the last half a century, have been built around the uranium mining. When we started mining in northern Saskatchewan, it was up along the Athabasca, Lake Athabasca, in this area here. These mines were simply deserted and never decommissioned or cleaned up until 2010, in which time the Saskatchewan Research Council, with the communities, managed to start cleaning up some of the mines. We still have, and in the north, we there are still many mines going on. There's Rabbit Lake, Cigar Lake. Are all the mines are in this particular basin, with one exception. Over on this side is a Patterson, a proposed mine. It's not there yet. They propose to actually empty a lake, deposit all the mining tailings in situ. And this is probably the biggest question of what is happening to the health and welfare of people in these areas from uranium mining. There are Key Lake Mill, MacArthur River Mine, McLean Lake, and Rabbit Lake, and some of the wealthiest or richest ore in the world is found in northern Saskatchewan. One of these mines, Cigar Lake, has been considered to be about 17% uranium, which outranks places that are mining for 1% by a long shot. The roads aren't shown very well here, or at least, or maybe this is an old map, but the road here goes well up into the area here called Points North, but that was basically built not for the people in the north, but for the uranium mining companies. But what are the effects on the health and welfare of the north, or on the miners themselves? A monitoring report from 2012 showed lower than, let's stop the share here, showed lower than sorry, it showed the monitoring report in 2012 showed lower than expected amounts of uranium and most mining waste in the water and air near the communities of Kamsel Portage, Uranium City, Fond du Lac, Black Lake, Stony Rapids, and Wollaston Lake, Hatchet Lake. The exceptions were molybdenum, uranium, nickel, and selenium from the Rabbit Lake mine in the runoff areas. So to this extent, to this date, no study has done, especially in the communities, in terms of looking at women or children in terms of absorption of these heavy metals. There have been many studies on the uranium miners themselves over the years, and the French study, which did it in 5-year allotments, is probably the most interesting, because what it does is it says back here in the 1950s, this is, believe it's 5 out of 100 miners developed lung cancer, whereas in the 1990s, it's 1 out of 100. And this is because of better ventilation, and also many of the mines have become surface mines, like open pit mining. And I'm going to do another, well, maybe I don't need to, I wanted to do another share with something that Doug has already shown, and that is the uranium decay chain. This is uranium-238. This comprises 99.3% of the uranium that comes out of the ground. And in northern, and so this is the uranium-238 that we're talking about. And as with Doug mentioning that the radium and radon are the probably the most worrisome elements in the chain, we also have polonium-210 that is so toxic that the amount that's in a period at the end of a sentence in a newspaper was used to kill a Russian spy in, I believe, 2007. And he literally died on the newspaper headlines. We watched him go. Once the element has been taken into the body, like radium as a calcium substitute, it stays there. It's quiet. And if it was just any old element being picked up, it would be fine. But the thing with the radium or the radon is that it continually sends off little blasts of ionizing radiation, which can destroy the structures of the cells around them. So that the cellular structure, whether it's the genetic material, whether it's enzymes, whether it's something that even the color of skin can be attacked by these little blasts or bombs of energy and altered so that the cell does not behave properly and does not do the things that it was meant to do. It doesn't, if it's supposed to be producing enzymes, it may not produce enzymes. And I believe that it's correct that we should be doing more research on how this happens and whether or not there are increases in coronary artery disease or diabetes as a result of radiation from any of these elements or elements from other radioactive or energy from other radioactive elements that can cause cellular damage. We mentioned the likely culprit for the uranium miners' cancer is the radon, because it's always going to be accompanying any place that you have uranium. A concern for the future, however, is wherever there is mining tailings on the surface, there's going to be continued production of radon into the air. Radon is heavier than air and can be picked up by winds and travel as far as 1,000 kilometers from the site in which it's produced. Now, radon isn't the only problem, but it disintegrates or decays into polonium, lead, bismuth, more polonium, lead, bismuth, and the polonium-210 that stays around a little longer and is so toxic. So we wind up having more toxicity with the radon than 3.5 days when we breathe it in. And because radon decays in 3.5 days and isn't around a long time, it's and it's a gas. The polonium is a solid and falls out of the air. So we have the radon changing into the polonium. The polonium can fall out of the air and land on plants, which are eaten by the animals in the north, or for that matter, can land on your sheets and pillowcases and clothing. It is very toxic. Background radiation is, how do I stop sharing? Stop sharing, there it is, stop sharing. Background radiation is the radiation that we find in numerous situations like the sun. Background radiation is, we're told sometimes by the nuclear industry that because we're always exposed to background radiation, therefore we can tolerate radiation. And the fact is, no radiation is safe, right down to zero. There is no lower limit at which ionizing radiation does not affect us. And the fact that we're all exposed to radiation is no excuse to try and expose us to more radiation. There was a Swiss environmental study, which unfortunately I had on my slides and I can't find it or my slides now. And it which indicated a difference in health in the very low levels of radiation, whether the difference between 1 millisievert per hour and 1.5 millisieverts per hour. And by using a Swiss population, Swiss don't move around very much. They were looking at teenagers and discovered that you have an increase in all cancers, but especially tumors of the brain, as you increase the very low doses of radiation. And of course, we've already talked about radon, which I have too much of in my house. And I'm going to, it's too high, so I wind up opening windows a lot. The thing is, I don't know if there's how much radiation is outside. And we've talked about, there's other illnesses that develop through intake of uranium, which is a heavy metal. With all the problems of any heavy metal, lead, mercury. In 2013, when I was working as a locum in La Loche, we accepted and transferred a miner, not a miner, sorry, a worker from Clough Lake Mine. And he was in renal failure. So we transferred him down to Saskatoon, which is our tertiary investigative center, and sent a note with him saying that we believed that he might be in renal failure due to the fact that he worked in the uranium mine. But because he was not a miner, it was discounted as a possibility. So when he came back and wound up having dialysis, which for him was a 7-hour trip every 3 days to Regina, I started pursuing him in terms of how he could have high levels of uranium. And it turned out that he was a janitor who picked up cigarette butts and re-rolled them from the floor. So there he has miner's boots that he's cleaning up with after probably tracking in the uranium and had uranium renal disease. He was, in fact, once we were able to show that, awarded workman's compensation, and he recovered almost normal kidney function to die 5 years later of lung cancer. In 1991, the first time I became interested in uranium mining and health, we had 4 patients that were diagnosed with lupus in a single year. Now, this is not a large population in Isle Cross, so that was a bit of a blip. We spoke to the rheumatologist, the specialist that deals with lupus, asking about why there might be, is that they noticed any connection to uranium, and they said no, this is just what they call a cluster. That's how how researchers tend to describe odd groups out. However, that was 1991. In 2013, a Harvard study indicated that the estrogenic effect of uranium could result in more lupus in the males in the area. And that was the really odd thing about it, is that we had men with lupus. I had filed before at least 2 months or a month ago, whenever I received notification of the Waterkeepers opportunity to talk, filed access of information with the cancer, the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency, which only in 2008 started collecting data on populations in terms of geographic locations in Saskatchewan. And needless to say, I haven't received anything yet. I think in both Northern Saskatchewan, and we ran into this when we were in Tanzania, the local people told us, well, how could this be bad for us? Because the recruiters who are recruiting people for the jobs rub it on their cheeks. And of course, uranium being and that's amazing. It was the same story as being used on two continents. And yeah, alpha particles don't go through the skin, but once they're in the body, they can cause the damage with their alpha particles. Don't see anybody coming on there. So back to how this ionizing radiation causes damage. We have alpha particles, which are somewhat large and don't go through the skin. We have beta particles, which can go through the skin. They're small, they're negatively charged, and they can go through the skin. But both of these can be ingested. And there's the problem. Once they're ingested, they're next our biological cells. And while they're busily sending off their little packets of energy, they are ionizing. And that's what we mentioned before. So ions are both how our body works, but also how it can destroy itself. We also have gamma rays, which are the same as X-rays. They can go straight through our body, but they leave a little trail of ions behind them. Sometimes cells recover. In fact, most of the time they do. Think of the number of people who've had many X-rays and have no sign of any kind of cancer that as a result of that. So we know that our bodies can do a certain degree of toleration. In fact, we know that because the cosmic rays, the sun's rays, can cause cancer. But most of us don't get cancer, and we just get sun damage to our skins if we live long enough. So I suppose besides the concern that I have over ionizing radiation in the north, I'm also very concerned about the medical use of ionizing radiation. I've mentioned X-rays, but there's also CT scans are much more, give much more exposure. And in fact, in the Canadian Medical Journal, there was a study showing that CT scans of children show an increase in cancers, solid cancers, in fact, and the increase is particularly noticeable once they have had 2 or 3 such scans. And for cancer sufferers, nobody would deny that using radiation has been a lifesaver for many people. But while it's killing the cancer, it can also affect the normal cells. There is an increase in secondary cancers for being treated with radiation, and it is about between 3 and 18%. And the big variation, it really means you can't say where you are on that unless you know exactly what the dose is and how it's being prepared or how it's being delivered and to which part of the body. And there's many ways in which ionizing radiation has been used for treating cancers. So in my conclusion, I'm going to say that we all have in our bodies, all of us born after 1945 have traces of strontium-90 and cesium-137 from the nuclear bomb tests and the nuclear power generation. And it's all part of as far as I'm concerned, an unprincipled industry that knew from the beginning that what they were working with was not good for human health. Thank you. I can't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Dewar.
Yes, thank you, Dale. That's what I was saying when I was still muted. Thank you. That was a great talk. I learned a lot. I did have a couple of little questions though. So for people who live in these areas where radium and uranium poisoning might be happening or being exposed, what are some signs that people might look for to if they're concerned that they might be exposed or suffering from these illnesses? Are there any kind of things that they might want to flag with their physicians that say, like, you know, this might be, you know, from my exposure?
That's a really good question. How do you tell whether you're being exposed after you're exposed? That's sort of what you're saying? Like how
Yeah,
would you
like if
tell
you've
how
been
a small
exposed.
amount is? I don't think we know, and that's one of the real problems with radiation and the way in which the industry has been able to explode in spite of the health effects of radiation, because the effects of ionizing radiation aren't felt for 6 to 30 years after you've been exposed. The Hiroshima victims, when they in Japan, they've been following people from the Hiroshima bombs, and they do I think it's called the Life Health Study, and it's a longitudinal study. So all of these people are followed for well, now it's 80 years. Have been followed for 79 years. And what they've discovered is that people, if we're talking about cancer, let's talk about breast cancer. If we're looking at breast cancer, it doesn't develop until the same time it would normally develop. So our peak of breast cancer is usually in the ages of 50 and 60, just as women are coming out of menopause. That's the peak time of developing breast cancer. And that's the same with the atomic survivors, but there's more of them developing it. So they were exposed, they're more likely to develop it. I think that's probably the same thing that Doug has found in his health studies.
For sure. And so if you're living in a place that you might be susceptible to exposure, is there any way that you can minimize your exposure, or it's just there in your environment and there's nothing really you can do?
I commented about opening my windows because I have the accepted level of radon in your house is 200 becquerels per meter cubed. And I have in my sleeping room, which is in the lower floor, I have 380. So I open my windows when I'm sleeping. A very simple way to decrease the amount. And then it comes down to 180. The thing that I would like to know is what is the amount in the outside. I also tested my water. Now, this is not something that everybody can do easily. And I looked for tests on water that's supplying communities in the north, and I couldn't find that they have been tested. I didn't go to the extent of trying phoning any communities and finding out from the people who look after their water to see what it is, but it's $220 to have your water tested for uranium and heavy metals. So you don't do it very often. And we discovered in 2014 that our water, which is lovely tasting, has suddenly had more than 20 micrograms of uranium in it. And I'm lucky enough to be able to afford a reverse osmosis unit, which we inserted into the drinking water. But not everybody can do those kinds of things. And especially in Saskatchewan, if I'm down in the south and I'm getting those kinds of numbers, what are other people getting? You know, I don't know. I think that one of the things we should be asking the Saskatchewan government is to have free free testing of water available so that people can know whether they're running a risk, and then can make some kind of, like, even if you're buying, then wind up buying only your drinking water. That's a lot easier to do than, which we did for a while. We thought, oh, well, this is a blip, and it was going to go away, but it didn't go away. So we still have too much uranium in the water. I think those are just simple things that I've had to do. I mean, there's other things in terms of radiation that we receive from medical tests. I think it's very valid to ask your physician when they're ordering an X-ray or something else, how that's going to, ask the question, how is that going to change your treatment? If they're going to give you an antibiotic anyway, why do you need an X-ray? You could say, I'm going to come back at a later date. Or I have a friend who said, how about if I do that? And how if I do that if the problem recurs? So, I mean, of course, you're going to submit to X-rays if you've broken bones, but there may be times that the X-ray is simply something that the physician, they just have a checklist in their minds and they're run through the checklist. We used to have a checklist, and we used to X-ray every patient who came into the hospital. How horrible.
That's a really good point. I've never even thought to like question sometimes while I'm getting an X-ray. The doctor says get an X-ray and you just go get one and you don't really think about it.
You don't think about it. You don't think it could be damaging.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up. I will definitely be thinking about that next time the doctor orders an X-ray for me.
Well, actually, there is a whole file called, we're trying to teach doctors, and we're teaching them through a program called Choosing Wisely. And it specifically talks about things like chest X-rays and this chest X-rays in children.
Oh, well, that's good that that dialogue is starting with physicians. We did have one question from our viewers. So this is for both of you. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it, but someone asked, are there any uranium mines in Alberta historically, currently, or prospectively? Did you guys know of anything like that, or that's not really your area?
I don't think there are, but I would be surprised if there wasn't something up in the Athabasca area, because there's so much on this side. But they're so busy digging it up for oil. Do we know what? Anybody seen a picture of the tar sands from the air? It looks like it's pretty messy.
Yes, Tori has seen a lot of those photos. And I think, Tori, you did a quick little fact check and you didn't see anything for prospective mining coming up, did you?
Yes, I didn't see anything on the horizon for Alberta, but I mean, you know, the impacts from communities would still like downstream communities because the water flows north, right? It will
Yeah.
it'll
Well,
still pass provincial boundaries. It'll end up in NWT. It'll end up in the Arctic Ocean drainage basin.
well, look what the mining, the oil and the petroleum industry has done to Fort Ship. I mean, I just bleed for those people.
Yeah, the fragmented forest is really scary. I was lucky enough to be shown around Dene country and up around McClelland Lake. And one of the things, the folks who were showing me, we passed a hunt camp, a cabin that was just a cabin and a little few trees around it, gated, and all the trap line was gone. It was, that's the hills. The Fort Hills were flat. There
Oh,
weren't hills, it was flat.
they're cut off.
Yeah.
Mined
And so that's, the defragmentation of the boreal forest. That's a huge entity. It's a huge living, life-giving entity.
Well, that was all the questions that I had and all the questions our viewers had. Was there any other last thoughts from you, Dale, or you, Doug, before we say goodbye?
Well, I got a comment for Doug. I'm going to give you a hard time, Doug. We've been making an effort to no longer refer to the progeny as daughters.
Yeah, I was aware when I said that, but you're saying progeny instead of daughters? Is that what you do?
Progeny,
You say radon.
offspring.
I've heard that. Yeah. As I said it, I wondered a little bit whether I was, but I haven't talked about this in a long time, and so I think I'm a little rusty. Yeah, it doesn't change the underlying science, but it is the
No, it doesn't.
It's yeah. I had one other thing that I didn't mention, and Beverly, one of your questions for Dale made me think about it. I am working with an engineer in Ottawa who has an instrument that he has developed. So I told you that radium deposits in the bones. Some of it turns into radon, and some of the radon that comes out of the bones gets exhaled in your breath. And so he has developed this instrument that measures radon and exhaled breath, very, very tiny amounts. And we're trying to show that it is effective at if someone has elevated radium in their bones, that we would be able to detect it on their breath from the radon. And we have the instrument. He's tried it on some people. We actually have not found anyone yet who had enough exposure that we saw radon exhaled. And I think that's just because we haven't found people who had high exposures yet. But if we get that working, we get it miniaturized, it can be moved around. That would be a way to measure lifetime exposure to radium, because the radium is in your bones for your life, and the amount coming out of your breath would be proportional to the amount that's in your bones. So that's been a very slow project. There's been progress, but it's taken a long, long time, and I don't know when it'll be ready. I also think if anyone listening knows people who can get to Ottawa and are likely to have had high uranium exposures, uranium ore exposure rather in the past, we would love to enroll them and test them. It just involves sitting and breathing into the instrument for 10 minutes, and then we get a reading from it. So anyway, I forgot to put that into my slides, but your question made me think about it, because as Dale said, it is a big problem that very hard to tell how much exposure someone has. There's just not a good way to do that. And if we could get this working, then you still need this sophisticated instrument to do it, but you would be able to screen people for lifetime radium exposure.
And if we had any viewers who are watching who were going to be in the Ottawa area and wanted to get in touch with you to get to try that out, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, they could email me. My email is B as in boy, RUGGE at UCHC.edu. That's my work email at the University of Connecticut. We also have some money. I don't know if we could get someone from Northern Saskatchewan, but if we could transport people a little bit of a ways to get you to Ottawa as well for that.
Maybe we should figure out how to transport him to Northern Saskatchewan.
Well, the problem is it's still a lab bench instrument. It hasn't been
Oh.
miniaturized yet. So but we want to show that it works and show that it really does what we want. And then he'll work on making a smaller version that could be transported around.
Right.
I think I have to bring up, since you mentioned Ottawa, there's actually an action coming up in Ottawa to join to stop the nuclear waste later this week. And it's the second rally to oppose the deep geological bearing of nuclear waste, the project along GCB. And the organizers are going to gather during the annual Canadian Nuclear Association conference outside the Westin Hotel in Ottawa
Wow.
from February 28th, March 1st, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. daily, to make it loud and clear that the Algonquin nations do not consent to the Chalk River NSDF project. So, yeah, I have to say that and shout that out. And there is amplification package out there. I'm going to post that on the comment section after the end of the broadcast, but I just wanted to make sure, so if there's folks in the Ottawa area that are watching this, and if you want to connect with Doug, and you're going to be around there, there's definitely going to be people around February 28th to March 1st. So I just thought I'd mention that. So thank you for indulging me.
Well, that's exciting. Thank you for mentioning it, because I've been certainly following the Chalk River. Well, that's not actually a deep dump. That's a near surface facility. It's absolutely crazy how much they think they're going to put there and say that it'll sit there for 500 years. I mean, who are these gods?
Yes, for sure. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tori. And we'll also, for everyone watching, we'll have this posted and we'll put Doug's email and some information, like Tori said, about that action. So I'd like to thank both you, Dale, and Doug for joining us tonight. It was a very informative evening and I learned a lot. I thank you everyone who joined us, and for our viewers, it was very wonderful that you could take time out of your evening to spend with us. If you want to catch up with the past webinar series on uranium that we have, Keepers of the Water have put on, you can see them on our socials, our Facebook page, our YouTube channel. And keep tuned for any updates. We post information there all the time. Tori's always busy letting everyone know what's going on because she's the keeper of all the information. So that's it for this evening. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Beverly Andrews with Keepers of the Water, and we'd like to thank you for your time and for your support, and keep the fight up. Have a good evening.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
I'm glad to see you again, Doug.
Is that the end of the record?